In this video, we're going to take this shot, do a basic Rec 709 conversion, and end up with this result using Color Finale 2 Pro. This is a lesson in my color grading masterclass, which fully covers Color Finale 2 Pro, as well as those who use Final Cut. If you're a Color Finale 2 Pro user, you will absolutely benefit from the course, so make sure you check it out after this. And without further ado, let's watch the lesson. Okay, so we're going to need to convert this to Rec 709. Like we've learned, there are a couple different ways you can do that. If you have your log profile in the ACES color transform option, you can take that route. I understand not everyone has their log profile in there, so if you don't, then just follow the input LUT step. Sorry, the LUT browser step. So hit this, then you would go to wherever your S-Log3 to Rec 709 LUT is, and apply it there. But let's go about using the ACES color transform for this shot. So let's hit ACES. And the input space is, of course, S-Log3. Output space, Rec 709, 100 nits. Now, like we adjusted in the Final Cut Pro half of this lesson, we're going to need to set our exposure. The shot was a little overexposed, so we need to make sure we get it sitting at a better range before we start going in and making some tweaks. It just makes the process easier. So the nice thing with ACES is you don't have to add this exposure adjustment before any input LUT because there is no input LUT. Instead, we can just go right into this exposure adjustment slider here and just dial this back a bit. But actually, just so we can do before and afters, let's hop into our layers panel and bring up our offset wheel and make the exposure adjustment there. Just pull down. There we go. Get this sitting in a good range. And now let's go about adding our contrast. So we can rename this. Right click, rename. Just call it exposure. And remember, with adding contrast when using the ACES color transform option, you will need to bring up false color. That way you know if you are crushing your blacks or blowing out your highlights, because if not, it'll show that you're good on the Luma waveform when you are in fact not. You're erasing detail in parts of your shot. So because we need to make big pushes to our shot, we use the color wheels, the primary color wheels, instead of the log wheels, because remember, the log wheels make small compartmentalized pushes to each range, so they don't affect the shot gradually like the primary color wheels do. And so because we need to make big pushes, we use these wheels. So let's lower our shadows until we see purple, then dial it back. Something right about there. And then go up with our gain till we see red. Dial it back. And then we'll need to turn this off. Adjust our midtones just to find where their skin is looking good. Okay, we can add in some saturation. We can actually get away with maybe even a little bit more contrast. Let me lower this just a bit. There we go. We'll leave it here for now, and let's toggle off our false color. Maybe even bump in more sat. Okay, now we need to balance the shot. With commercial grades, you want to make sure that the person's skin is an accurate color and that the shot does not have a gross cast on it, because usually we want the shot to feel realistic enough that we as viewers feel like we could be there using that product in that cool, exciting location. So what are our known variables that we can use to balance the shot? We don't have many white or gray things that we can use. Instead, let's use their skin. So let's pull up our vector scope. Let's go to isolate ellipse. And let's crop into her skin here. Now, he has a sunburn, so his skin is a little bit off. We can see if we can adjust that a little bit later, but we'll use her skin for now. Okay, so we can see that her skin is not accurate. It should be on the skin tone line. So let's head back to that exposure wheel adjustment and go to our offset wheel so we can affect the whole shot. And let's swing the hue slider away from the red and magenta quadrant to try and get her skin on the line. We don't want to push too much. Obviously, this adds way too much color into the shot. Remember, get our skin to be about 10 to 40% of the skin tone line if you connect the yellow and red hue. So right about there. And then we can just deselect this. So now if we undo this and redo, look at that. So we went from a much cooler shot to a lot warmer. And just by looking at our vector scope, you'll see that we balanced the shot a ton more. Now, I would like to add more contrast because it just is too faded. First, let's rename this because we know this is not just an exposure adjustment, but also balance. Here is our contrast and set. Let's pull up a Luma curve so we can kind of fine tune where our contrast is added. Let's go to the very bottom part of our Luma curve so we can pump in some contrast into the very darkest parts of our image. And keep in mind, when you're using the ACES color transform option, just small pushes to these different curves will make big adjustments to your shot. So just small little adjustments here. And then go to your midtones, and we're just going to pump in a little bit of a pop, increasing the brightness in our midtones and a little bit in our highlights. Right there. Let's make sure that we're a little hot in our sky here. But the thing is, we're not going to get much detail back in this area. I'm not too worried. I'm more thinking about their skin. I want to make sure that their skin is bright. And so if you happen to be erasing detail in a sky that was white to begin with, there's not a lot of detail in that anyways. But if there were clouds that we can see and stuff, then it would be more of an issue. Nevertheless, what you can do is add a log wheel. And we also are crushing our blacks just a little bit. And you can go to your highlights exposure slider. And like we've learned, the log wheels make compartmentalized adjustments. So you can just lower the exposure of just your highlights. And you'll notice that this gets us to a safe range without affecting our midtones at all. So key, so clutch. That was kind of lame. It's so clutch. All right, so let's toggle this off. And see, not even much of a visible adjustment, but at least you know you're making a difference. And also, I'm not too worried that we're crushing our blacks here. If you really wanted, you can push this up a little bit, but frankly, it just is not making too big of an adjustment. And I don't really care if we're losing detail in just this area. Let's toggle this back off. We can rename this. We'll just call it clipping. Whoops. I pressed the wrong button here. Rename it and call it clipping adjustment. And we may need to actually move this to the very end of all of our corrections because potentially we may push in more brightness and or less brightness into our shadows and highlights at the end of the workflow. Let's just call this clipping adjustment. And let's go about tweaking our colors just a bit. I'm just going to move this right here and let's pull up our 6 vectors. Let's go to the green. And like I mentioned in the Final Cut Pro half of this lesson, Sony cameras tend to add a little bit too much saturation for my taste in our greens. So we can go about adjusting that just by heading to our green vector and decreasing this. Now, this is totally up to you. You may like how punchy this is. I actually would prefer if we make it less vibrant and maybe even warm up the greens just a bit and just desaturate just a little bit. Now you could go, if you wanted to go for more of a muted green kind of hipster type look, you could swing the hue of this to more of a teal and then desaturate this, lower the brightness just a little bit. Remember, we don't want this to affect our shot negatively too much. And that gives you more of this cooler hipster look. And that looks pretty good too. I'm pretty torn. I like this better, actually. Let's go with this kind of muted green look. Maybe even give it a little bit more saturation. We can actually hop into this blue vector and just affect this a little bit. Just have this swinging. You'll notice on the vector scope that this will take that blue and just push it a little bit closer to cyan, making our colors just a tad more uniform. And I've just made desaturate it a little bit so it doesn't stick out so much. Now this red is very saturated. Let's scrub through. Uh-oh, my skimming feature isn't working. That happens sometimes. And so I can manually skim. So we are way too saturated. Look at that. Remember, you should generally not add so much saturation that it touches, if you were to draw imaginary lines between all these quadrants, that the color does not touch that imaginary line. And obviously this is getting way too close. So instead of hopping into the red vector, which adjusts their skin, remember, what we can do is see if we can use our HSL curves, which is going to be right here, hue versus sat, and see if we can just select this specific red. We're going to have this selected. Nope, it's not working. Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to have to close out and come back in. Okay, so now this should work. Yep, so let's select this and let's make an even narrower selection. And just see if we can... Whoa, we're in hue versus hue. My fault, guys. Let's just reset this and go into hue versus sat. Select this red. Make a narrower point. And lower this saturation a little bit. Now, it's going to break too much if we lower too much. So we just want to bring it down just a little bit. So let's rename these two. So we can just call this color adjustment. We can actually hop in here and go to sat versus Luma and just see if we have any saturation in the darkest parts of our shot. So we can take that out and get them closer to a true black. Extend this out. That way we're just cleaning up our shadows. And we can actually do the same thing for our highlights if we need to. I'm not even sure we need to, though. Yeah, we're fine. Okay. We can go to our sat versus sat for this last section of the hue versus layer. Go to the most saturated areas in your shot, which is going to lie towards the right. Just decrease that. There we go. It doesn't do too much. This one, for some reason, the sat versus sat curve in Color Finale 2 Pro doesn't make as big of an adjustment as the Final Cut Pro sat versus sat curve. I'm not sure why. And then let's increase the saturation of the least saturated areas just a little bit. This makes too big of an adjustment. And then I'll just make a slight drop off here. So we could call this saturation correction. Let's scrub through and see what we have. So that looks pretty good so far. I would like to see if we can go in and kind of fix the sunburn that he has. Just make my boy look a little bit better. So let's use an offset wheel here and then just group it because we're going to be making a mask. And just in case we need to have another layer added to the group to affect the mask, it just makes it simple. And then you can go in and adjust it. So let's use the HSL mask and change the display to composite so we can see what we're doing. I did it again. We need to make sure we make the selection on the area that we want. And now switch this to composite. Or actually, let's do mask input this time. And just see if what we can select. I actually think this is a pretty good selection. If we turn this off and on, is this getting the red area? For the most part. Yeah, right about there. Okay, so we'll call it there and then make sure you add the blur because this will for sure show up. If you don't, just increase it a little bit, hop back to your log wheel and just push away from that red. And you'll notice that that just kind of takes it out a little bit. Now we could have probably brought in a color wheels and just decreased the saturation a bit. So that helps quite a lot. So if we were to turn this off and on, just look at that. It just cleans it up a lot more. Let's rename this Skin Adjustment. We'll close this out. So here's the before, here's the after. No more sunburn. One of the last things I would like to do is to go about creating a little vignette over them. That way our viewer focuses in on them more and this perimeter isn't so distracting. So let's bring up a Luma curve, and then we're going to hit, actually let's group it just in case. Hit the mask button, and we're going to select the ellipse mask and just make a giant oval over them. And we're going to feather this. So let's do 80%. And unlike the Final Cut Pro mask, the Final Cut Pro tracking feature, this one tends to do a better job. So let's look. And it's much smoother than when we tried it with the Final Cut tools. Now I'm going to fast forward this part so you don't have to watch this tracking. So once that's done, you will open up your curves. Actually, right-click this and hit Invert Parent Mask. So now this layer will affect everything outside of that ellipse that we made. So then you can go in and we'll just pull down from kind of our lower midtones and just pull down here, and you'll see that this just looks like we had some type of light on them on set. We're just going to pump it just a bit more. And then we can actually duplicate this. So hold Option and drag, except don't invert it this time, and reset. And all we're going to do here, go to your midtones, whoops, and just give a slight push. And then go down to your shadows and a slight drop. So now if I undo and redo this, you'll see that this just adds more contrast, more pump, it's livelier. And then this outside adjustment gives us that vignette. So we could rename this if you really wanted to be organized. You could do outside, inside, and then call the whole thing vignette pump. So here's what that adjustment did. So it's almost like it's guiding our eyes into them in the center of the shot. Maybe that was a little bit too much for that inside adjustment. So let's just hop in here, and it's as easy as selecting inside and then just dialing back the mix. You see that? Full 0. Let's just go maybe right about here. So here is the look. So we went from this to this, and obviously this is a log clip. Let's see if we can, I'll group all of these except for the exposure and balance, just so we can see a better before and after. So here's before, and here's after. Before, after. So here's the workflow we just went through. We transformed our shot using the ACE's color transform option. We adjusted our exposure and balanced the shot. Then we added contrast and saturation. Then we went into our curves and started creating a little bit more contrast just to give more of a pop by lowering the very darkest parts of our shot and just increasing the midtones and a little bit of the highlights, creating a unique S-curve. And then we went and just tweaked our highlights and shadows because they were clipping a little bit. We could even put this at the end here, but it doesn't really matter to me. We might as well. Let's just swing this to the very end. Okay, then in the color adjustments tab, we went about tweaking the greens. This is totally up to you. This just makes it a little bit more of a complementary color look by swinging our greens more towards teal and then just desaturating them a bit for kind of more of a hipster look. Take it or leave it. If you like it a little punchier, you can add in more saturation into your greens. I prefer this look for this shot. And then we just adjusted the saturation in our shot by taking out the saturation in our highlights and blacks, as well as adjusting the overall saturation. So adding saturation in the least saturated areas and decreasing saturation in the most saturated areas. And then we went about fixing kind of some of the saturation in parts of his skin, a little bit in hers too, but from sunburn and also from our saturation adjustment. And that, as you can see, just kind of cleaned it up a lot. And then we went in and created our vignette pump, which just helps guide our eyes more into them. Now, if you wanted, if this was too much of a vignette, you can decrease the mix a little bit. I kind of like it. Actually, what I may do is just hop in, add maybe 90% feathering, and then just decrease the outside just a little bit. There we go. And that is the look. And then, of course, we just added this from here, just moved it. So this essentially was the before and after. Before and after. If you're tired of not being able to get the looks that you want for your videos, check out the FCP Color Grading Masterclass. I'll put the link in the description and in the comments, and have a great rest of your day.